Well, good afternoon if you are on the East Coast of the United States or the Central United States. Good morning if you are further west, and good morning if you are in parts of Asia. Good evening if you are in the Middle East or parts of Europe, all of Europe for that matter, and Africa and South America. Um, I'm Fred Plotkin. It's Friday, so this must be Fred Plotkin on Fridays, in which I have guests who inspire me. That's the common denominator for how people get invited here. And the fellow joining me today is someone I've been inspired by for much longer than he knows, especially because he's so young. So how could I have been inspired by him early? Well, I spot talent is all I can say. And my guest is Zachary Woolfe. And Zach is the classical music editor for the New York Times. And therefore, part of what we're going to talk about today is not just being a reporter and being a critic and being a writer, but being an editor as well, because those are different hats all on the same hat rack. So, Zach, welcome very much.
Thank you.
Yep. So the first thing I want to say to you, Zach, is you are an excellent writer. That's what really caught my attention a long time ago, because a lot of people, I'm going to be blunt, who cover the arts are not good writers. I'm not sure why that is. And I don't know if you agree with me, but I find that a lot of them either know the art forms really well, but are trapped by terminology or the inability to say much more than good in German, schön, in Italian, bello, and it doesn't go much beyond that. Or they are so into their own writing that it obscures the message of what they're trying to say. The reason your work caught my eye well before you and I ever met is because, in my view, you strike that balance better than almost anyone out there, except for me.
I was about to say.
I'm kidding. But I mean, I have very high standards, and you, from the first moment I met you, seem to achieve the balance that I would want to achieve in my writing, of being clear in the writing, of having very good word choice, but also making the reader understand what you are writing about. Now, it's a whole range of things, from reporting on a particular event that you were present at to covering trends in the arts, such as finance or social issues, whatever we want to call them, to occasionally a very personal article. Did you figure that out for yourself? Did someone guide you toward this concept of how we balance writing and information in covering the arts? I mean,
there have been influences, I would say. I mean, I've been guided by wonderful editors over the course of my career thus far. I mean, from Tom McGovern and Sarah Vilkomerson at the New York Observer to Jim Astrike, firstly at the Times, and then a host of other people at the Times who have been instrumental really in working with my copy. And then writers who I've been influenced by, critics and not. I mean, I early on in college took a course on Greek tragedy with Daniel Mendelsohn, who is a critic about other things, but is a classicist by training. And his approach to criticism, even if I've done it kind of in music, I mean, was really important for me, and kind of just the way you think of a topic, the way you think of the field that you are working in, the way that you are speaking not just about a performance, but about what things mean in a broader context. And I think once you get there, your writing changes. It's not about technicalities, or if it's about technicalities, but it's about how every detail is magnified into a broader context. And so, yeah, writers from Virgil Thompson to Joan Didion to Sontag, all to Pauline Kael. And I mean, I've read lots of criticism, cultural criticism, and then just writing. I mean, I think that you just write, you read, and then hopefully you're able, not by copying, but just to kind of get a sense of like your sense of how a sentence or how 1,000 words should go.
Well, actually, let's go right to that point. If you say 1,000 words, I think that many people who read us and follow us and listen to us may not understand the structures and strictures of journalism. And we're going to talk today about the fact that journalism used to be something printed on a page, and now it's something that appears on a device, although it's still printed and still printed on a page. But yes, what it is something that's received differently and perceived differently by the people doing it. And people of my parents' generation, and to some degree people of my generation, but less so, are still very married to the page. I happen to love the tactile feel of a newspaper, a magazine, a book. I read the New York Times online, but I read the New Yorker as a magazine.
Same as me, yeah.
And I'm not sure quite why that is, but I read the Financial Times as a paper, but I read many other newspapers online. I read the Washington Post online, for example. But you said 1,000 words. An editor in the past, well, the old motto of the New York Times was all the news that's fit to print. And fit meant not just that it merited coverage, but that it actually fit on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And if you had to turn the page for continuity. If you have to write an article of 1,000 words, how do you approach it? And how is it different from an article of 500 words?
I mean, in terms of, I mean, this, we can talk about kind of the reverberations of that change in media for the way that the choices we make about coverage and changes in the coverage, because it's had huge impact throughout the paper, not just on classical music or culture coverage, but really throughout the entire organization and every news organization. But I think that when you have kind of certain basic lengths, I mean, you structure things, you pace things differently. The way, I mean, we now have a little monthly roundup of 5 albums each and 200-word reviews, and like what you're going to be able to do and how you can get into it in 200 words is very different than the album review you write that's 500 words. And it's not just that everything exactly that you have 3 sections and they each can get 25% or like double in size or whatever. It allows you, maybe then there's a certain length at which you feel like the introduction can be like a tease in a way, like, or like something unrelated, or once you're getting into 1,000 words, or then the beginning of a review can be quoting from the libretto. You can ease your way in a more kind of leisurely way. I mean, 1,000 words is still not that many words, but, and 1,200 or 1,500 or whatever, and you can just give more context, and the pace is just different. It's not like that means that that singers who got 1 sentence each should each get 3. You don't. It's not like mathematical that way. It's just this feeling can be a little richer, I think. So I mean, you approach it, I think, differently that way, where like kind of once you're in the like 1,000-word territory versus 500 even, you're able to kind of surround the events or like kind of talk about the piece more, as opposed to purely the performance at hand, or like kind of get into the works and what surrounds it and kind of play that way.
So you're an editor, and I'm going to ask you to put the editor hat on for just a moment. When you assign a piece, do you envision the piece, what it might contain, and then say, okay, this merits 500, 800, 1,000, 1,500 words? Or do you ask the journalist, what do you think it will need? How does that process begin?
I mean, usually it's I mean, there are still remnants of I mean, it has loosened a lot. I mean, in term when you move from print to not print to primarily digital, you're freed in certain ways from needing to fit in and like thinking about basic structures. It used to be really kind of like multiples of 250 that we were basically thinking in, and that has kind of remains a sort of thing. I mean, there are still sort of conventions, I would say, I mean, which are more than literal space, but what a New York Times review or feature feels like. I mean, you're, even as we've been freed, you still want everything to sort of feel integrated broadly. I mean, with exceptions, but like that the general kind of feel is that these things are all of a piece published by the same thing, and that there's not suddenly a lot of 5,000 word reviews, even though you could put anything online. So that the formats are still, again, in broad form the same, that a kind of longer critic's notebook, as we call it, like is 1,000 or 1,200, that features are like 1,200, like in the daily paper, that those rise to like 1,500 or 1,800 in the Sunday arts and leisure section, that like a kind of basic performance review is closer to 600 or 700 or 500. Like, so those are more kind of conventions, such that everything still feels kind of like of a piece than requirements. And there's a lot of variety. And I mean, occasionally, like it can be helpful. I mean, it's as an anchor to be like, I know I need to write 500 words and I'm writing 500 words, but now there is a little more, there's certainly considerably more flexibility than there was when I started writing, to say, like, if you've ended up with 800 words, it's not like we need to cut 300 necessarily. There's a more flexibility in terms of if this ended up being if we thought, okay, like this is going to be about 500 words, but it ended up being 1,000 words of good writing, we want to get the best piece possible, the piece that is there. And and so I'm not cutting or editing with an eye to word count exactly, but you just want to get the piece at its best.
You want it to be tight.
And yet there's oftentimes frequently edits will involve, I want more of, like, we write more. I mean, like, and that can sometimes get us over the page limit. And occasionally we'll have to cut for print, but we can put other stuff online now. So that is freeing.
Okay, that's a very important point I want to underline. You have to cut for print, that sometimes what appears in the print edition of the paper is not all that appears in the online edition.
I would say it's still, that is the I would say that's the exception. I mean, it's not uncommon, but it's not every piece. Like, it's not that it's not frequent, I would say. I mean, it happens. Yeah, I mean, one of the, like, between regularly and occasionally, I would say, like, and usually we're talking about a couple of sentences here and there, not large chunks or anything. Like, it's fairly minor.
When I read the print edition of the New York Times, Washington Post, and then read the digital editions often have URLs, they have links. So, yeah. For example, if you've written an article in which you make a reference to Bayreuth that you covered 5 years ago, you might have the link to that in the article online, whereas obviously you don't on the page. Does that affect the writing of the article? If I could read your article online and then go read your story about Bayreuth, does that affect how you write the article?
No, I mean, I think it can be really enriching the reading experience. I mean, and the obvious thing here is that you can include media. I mean, like, ways of people listening and watching clips or video. We have video, we have audio. I mean, there's ways of, I mean, when you're talking about music and performance, I mean, there's the opportunities beyond print are crucial and amazing. Like, it really is, it's incredibly helpful to have that. And so it's I wouldn't say that it's like writing so that we can put in certain links, but it gives, I think it gives a great opportunity to let the reader explore more. And I mean, to give context. And if we make an assertion, you can kind of give the study that, I mean, like anywhere in the paper, if you're sort of only able to do certain shorthand, like, and state something as a fact, but this was the study that you drew that fact from or whatever, you can include that. And it's sort of, yeah, I think it can be really enriching for the reader.
In a way, it's like having a footnote.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I had an editor at a completely digital news organization, a very important one, remain nameless, who believed that articles should not be particularly long because online readers, viewers don't sustain their concentration. And he discouraged me from putting in too many links because he said they'll go away from your story and they won't come back. I tried to explain to him immodestly that I write really good articles. And I know from readers' comments that they've read all the way to the end because they comment on the end.
Mm-hmm.
But do you, as an editor, and then perhaps you as a writer, think about article length in terms of will the reader stay with me?
I tend to agree with you that I mean, once you get into trying to sort of predict people's behavior, it's a losing battle. I mean, we know from statistics, it can be very depressing to learn, and this is throughout the paper, and actually probably classical music is better in this regard than some places of the paper. You look at what the average reader time spent is, and it was bracing for those of us who write these things, because when you're talking, it's short, primarily, a lot of the time. And in fact, internally, a metric that can be more powerful than page views is time spent. If the time spent on a story is high, that is actually as, if not more valuable than sheer numbers of people who clicked on it, because there might be a lot of people who clicked on it and then like read a sentence and left or whatever. But if for whatever reason this feature kind of got people, held their attention for a long time, and including if they finished it, that is, I think, that's more powerful. And especially when you're in the business of, as the Times is, of wanting to attract subscribers, though that is more, as opposed to just getting page views to get ad revenue primarily. So if you just want people really invested literally in the journalism. And so the time spent is important. So I mean, but all that said, trying to like predict behavior or like kind of calibrate it, like, I mean, I think I agree that there are some kind of blogs and formats where it's like every phrase is hyperlinked or whatever. I mean, just as a logistical rule, I think it's good to be judicious and not to over. And in general, they're going to other Times journalism. Like, I mean, not entirely, but like we try and like keep it to like, if there's context to be found in our past work, we do that. And there's other ways of doing that we have now in terms of like links that are embedded but not hyperlinks, or like kind of related links at the end. And so there's ways that I think it's only good. I mean, I don't think you're not going to trick somebody into sticking with you by not having hyperlinks. If they're going to be with you, they're with you. And it's the pieces that the story is the story. I think like getting too deep into trying to manipulate the reader is not going to work usually.
So I want to point out something that you said that I know innately, but maybe listeners don't always fasten on. It used to be, when we had so-called print journalism, that the newspaper came out every night, basically the New York Times, and trucks would trundle down the streets of New York City in all weather. It was printed in different plants around the city, and they would be dumped in big stacks at newsstands that would receive them and sell them. And in the 1980s, when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, I lived on 57th Street between 8th and 9th Avenues. Mm-hmm. At the corner of 57th and 8th, there were 3 newsstands that were open all night. and each one of them sold the Times, the Post, the Daily News, Newsday, had the Village Voice, had all these local foreign language publications. And a newsstand was a wonderful place to visit. And it was also the way of entry, usually for immigrants who were getting their first job in America. And now a newsstand primarily will have a few copies of the couple of the local papers, especially the foreign language ones. They'll sell a lot of candy and junk, and they'll sell lottery tickets and water. And compare that to Paris or Milan or a lot of Italian cities, or Vienna, in which newsstands still are rather glorious in terms of their offering and their aesthetics.
Very much so.
And it's something I miss here a lot in New York City. But it was based on the premise that we 24-hour New Yorkers would go out and buy the paper and get covered with ink. I remember always coming home from the Met about 12:30 at night and grabbing the Times of the next day, and the ink was still wet. And I would sit in my apartment on 57th Street and sort of calm down from the day and prepare for the next, reading the next day's New York Times. And very especially, there's a newspaper that I love called Variety. And when I went to Columbia Journalism School, the year I went, Variety turned 75. We all had to do master's projects, and mine was on the history of Variety, its impact on entertainment, and its impact on the English language. And Variety came out on Wednesdays, and it was the wettest ink. And even as a New York City boy, I would buy Variety because I was into this stuff even as a 7-year-old. And Variety, you knew that you were in show business in one form or another if you were reading Variety when it was still wet. Now, there's no such thing as hot type to print this stuff. The deadlines are completely different. It used to be, I mean, even when I went to journalism school, we were trained, we need 500 words and not 600, and you have to have it by 4:30 in the afternoon, no matter what. And now deadlines in some ways are different, in some ways not. Would you talk about, I know you're too young to have ever been covered with ink that way, but would you talk about the daily and nightly functioning of journalism, to which I would add one other thing. Some of my friends at the Times also blog. They're asked or required to have running commentary in addition to their journalism.
Yeah. Well, so there are still production schedules for the print paper, which sort of guide the rhythms of the paper, but no longer are those the only, like, is that the kind of, are those the only sense of deadline? And as you say, like, kind of, it's a rolling, every moment is a deadline, kind of. And so there's still looking to, we're still, and everywhere in the paper is looking to close their sections for in order to make the various print editions, and like those kind of continue through into the evening and into the night, the national edition and the local, I mean, the various things. For our purposes, we increasingly we are looking to have things, if I want some, I mean, increasing, not always, but if I want something to appear in print on Friday, I actually want that to be closed on Wednesday evening so that it can be online early Thursday morning and ready for print as the print production goes on through Thursday. But that 5 a.m., we want to set something on Wednesday night to publish at like 5 a.m. and because that's when it'll get the audience. That's when it can get the promotion on our home screen of the app. That's when it can get social promotion on Facebook, on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. So the deadlines, in a way, especially for culture, and this is not for breaking news, obviously, but for features and as much as we can do, we are trying to kind of like push back to that, to really get it up so it's done well in advance. I mean, much more so than it used to be. For reviews, they're turned around the following day. Like I'll file something from like by like 10 or 11 a.m. and get that turned around by the edited and everything by the early afternoon, such that I think that now, I mean, it varies a little bit. Like our hard print deadline for production for the arts pages are like 5:30 or so, like, or 6. And so, but because that needs to be set for, I mean, it's effectively copy needs to be like done by mid-afternoon, like really by mid-afternoon. And then the tiny adjustments can be made if necessary, like on top of that. But like, so things need to be sort of done for us by like, if we're talking about like 3.
Mm-hmm. As a reader, as myself as a reader, temporal issues have entered that I have a challenge with, because last week at some point, I read an article about in the food section about a restaurant in San Francisco called the Zuni Cafe,
Yeah.
which is a classic. And I knew the woman who was the chef there for many years. I spent a lot of time in San Francisco. And she died, unfortunately, rather young. And she was very influential. And it was a great restaurant. And it was in a part of San Francisco that was not developed for restaurants for all kinds of reasons. It was a groundbreaker.
Mm-hmm.
And what I didn't know is that behind it was a fellow, a gay man, who was instrumental in its creation. I knew the chef, but he apparently was the original founder. And I read the article last week and enjoyed it very much and learned things. And then the Wednesday, 2 days ago, the Wednesday food section arrived, and there was the article again. Wow. And I was in the print edition, because I read both print and online. And I must say that I was disoriented by the fact that I thought, well, I've read this article. And does this mean that people who only read the print edition are only discovering it now? And what if there are changes and corrections? So, for example, often you see online, this article has been updated to reflect changes, whatever. I like, with my news head on, I like to think that things are moving forward and happening, and that an article belongs in a place and time and a reference and so on.
Right.
And it must affect the way, I'll start with your department, but you could say the whole New York Times values how things are written, stated, and published.
It's with the weekly sections and their close. I mean, what used to be the case in the beginning of kind of the online Times is that specifically for the culture, like the Sunday arts and leisure section, everything would kind of get dumped online on Friday afternoon when no one reads anything anyway. So all of that stuff was not getting any readership, and it was ridiculous because that section, the Sunday sections and other weekly feature sections like food, don't close the night before next, because to space everything out for the production, arts and leisure actually closes on Tuesday for the following Sunday. And so there's no reason, all of that stuff is done. So there's no reason that, as is the case now, the stories that are going to appear in Sunday and arrive on your home delivery arrive in home delivery on Saturday, they should go online on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, like spaced out, and as if, so that there's not like this dump at the end of the week. So sometimes it's like been, several days. I mean, it could be Wednesday morning, like that something could arrive, and then it's really not in print for another Thursday, Friday, Saturday, like 4 days or something, or the print date is 4 days from then. And it's, it can be sort of disorienting, but at this point, a large percentage of people who are reading that are not getting like the print. I mean, there are a bunch of people where it's both, and it's a little disorienting where they're kind of taking it in as hybrid. But for most people, it's that allows them actually to be getting things at the right pace, or at a leisure, kind of everything is spread out. They're getting things in when it's sort of conceived of by the editors as sort of the right time for it. And with corrections, it can be challenging. And obviously with news, it can be hard to keep arts and leisure sometimes feeling super current. Like sometimes things intervene in several days. Like, I mean, when things close on Tuesday, things can change. If we're writing about a production, things can change about the production, and it's just a long like usually you kind of can be changing things much closer to publication if the facts change or if a singer is replaced or whatever it might be. And with some of the feature sections that close for, more in advance, it's more difficult. But
For the moment, I'd like to talk about coverage of theater, which is not part of your purview, as opposed to opera and classical music, for reason you'll understand. If you see a film such as All About Eve or just about any evocation of the New York theater, it used to be that after opening night, there would be a cast party. And at a certain point, somebody, usually the producer, would come in with the dripping wet pages of the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, the Daily News, the Post, and so forth, and read the reviews at the party, like in All About Eve,
right,
of the play, rather. And you would typically know if, at least in these movies, are you going to have a long run? Will this be a flop? Whatever. And when you collectively, you in music, as opposed to theater review, there are different ways that you are reviewing, and correct me if you disagree or think I'm wrong. One is you are reviewing for history, so that if you attended a concert that was a one-time concert in which a young artist made a debut, or a venerable old artist like Vladimir Horowitz made a comeback, or whatever, you would be covering for history. The second is you'd be covering something new. So if a new opera premieres, you are bringing your faculties to describe, and I'm choosing my verbs and my nouns very carefully, your faculties to describe what you saw and heard. Then there's what I call the money review. Namely, if the New York Philharmonic premieres a program on a Thursday, they typically do Thursday, Friday afternoon, Saturday evening, and perhaps Tuesday, perhaps not Tuesday sometimes. And when the review comes out, perhaps it will influence people to want to go to hear that performance.
Right.
Or at the Metropolitan Opera or any opera company, if the Met has lined up 6 performances of the Macropolis Case and you go to the opening of it, because the Macropolis Case by Janacek is a wonderful opera, but not everyone thinks to go to it, your review may influence people to go or perhaps not go. I'm not a fan of the concept of money reviews. I don't advise on that. I don't review that much. My choice, because I've worked in opera for so long, is to write about the art form, to teach, to explain, to promote the art form, rather than say, yes, go, or no, don't go. That doesn't work for me. But in writing, just stick to Zachary for the moment, these different forms of articles, how do you approach it differently?
I mean, much like with what we were saying before about trying to get too much into readers and their behavior, once you start like, what is this review like intended like as, and what's this kind of review versus this kind of review, it's you should I think you should approach a review of a one-off the same way you review. I mean, they have their different uses, obviously, and as you say, they're serving different functions. Unlike restaurant or theater critics, classical music critics really can't close a show or like propagate it. I mean, because there's generally at the very set and quite limited runs almost always. And the decision-making processes it's not commercial enterprises. So like the decision-making processes are insulated by a couple more, they're not unrelated to, I think, kind of like critical critical response, but they're insulated in a different way than commercial enterprises are, where it's just like consumer behavior and the product are like much more, it's right there. So with classical music and opera, you can't write, I mean, you want to write, if the Philharmonic or the Met does something, it gives an added, I think it's great when we could encourage, I mean, specifically when there's the ability to kind of encourage people to see something that is still running and to say, to be able to opine on something that people are still going to go to positively or negatively is another kind of feeling. But the review, I conceive of it the same way. And there is, and so it's not that it's going to come out differently. I think all of this is to say that I think classical music and opera critics should not be thinking in terms of like kind of closing a show. Like, I mean, what considerations that I think food critic, not that should make anyone like hedge themselves, or that theater critics should hold their punches because they have a different kind of power, but it's a different responsibility. It's a different ecosystem, and the way that does and should kind of, you keep that in mind, that you have that power. And it's not that you shouldn't be negative at all. I mean, but you're writing with the knowledge that you have a certain kind of power. And I know that I have a certain other kind of power, and that you're really like kind of reflecting on arcs of classical music in general and opera. They are slower, longer range planning, and that you do have an impact on that and on singers and on players and conductors and, I mean, artists and composers, and like kind of, but in a longer term way, not in a like, will this production open or close? And so we're all writing for the future, but the primary responsibility is to write for the reader, and the responsibility is to the reader and to the art form, and to kind of be writing kind of for readers on behalf of the art form. And you're also writing to the field and to artists second, like, I mean, to me, behind that. And your response, like, I mean, the primary thing you're doing is, even for something that has closed, even for a one-off concert that you're reviewing, you're providing a service to the readers. And what that is can vary kind of review by review, but you have to, I mean, you think of yourself as, I think, I mean, in service to the reader and to the art forms. I mean, like, so that's when, even with the one-offs, you are advocating on behalf of, or you are kind of, I think providing a service is the right way to the reader, and hopefully to music. I mean, and its history and the context and the ecosystem as a whole. You're attempting to contextualize, and merely the act of judging a performance is, to me, helpful to the ecosystem, to be sussing out, to be describing, to be saying what things are better and worse than other things, I mean, I think is healthy.
This leads to a flip side that is sometimes, not always, but sometimes a problem, that I believe that certain works and sometimes certain composers and occasionally certain performers are saddled with the critical consensus, whatever that is. And I'll give you two examples of two of my favorite operas. One of them is Andrea Chenier by Umberto Giordano, and the other is Simone Boccanegra by Verdi. And with Chenier, it's often described, especially in British media, and we in America are the heirs of British criticism in a way. And the values that sometimes appeared in British criticism of Italian opera being too emotional, whatever that means, means that the cheap emotion of Andrea Chenier, the opera, means that we don't really like it. That yes, the music is lovely, and yes, it gives nice work for the tenor and a good aria for the soprano, but we don't take this seriously. It's just too emotional. And then there's Simone Boccanegra, where I've read so many reviews where the critic will start by describing the unbelievability or the confusion of the plot. Now, I see that as a failing of the critic. I can describe the plot and its
Right.
meaning. Il Trovatore is another challenge. That's much harder, but Simone
Oh, I always
Boccanegra.
think that I do think Boccanegra is more in its way more confusing than Trovatore, but yeah, they're different confusing.
Yeah, no, sometime I'll take you to Boccanegra, you take me to Trovatore, and we'll explain to it.
Yeah.
But no, in fact, Laura Zajic, the great mezzo, describes perfectly Trovatore, so one can do that.
Yes.
But to me, Boccanegra has very deep feelings that are very connected to Verdi. And in many ways, I find it one of his most personal operas.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
in loving and respecting Verdi, I find my way into him, and I teach others often through the opera Simone Boccanegra. So when I read a review discounting the story as implausible, it's hard to take seriously the rest of the review. And I have issues with that, frankly, because I believe that perhaps we shouldn't rely on old tropes and find new ways into these works and renew them for people in ways that, I mean, I think that both Chenier and Boccanegra's operas can speak to our issues today very powerfully and without having to make excuses for them.
There's no room for cliches of any kind. I mean, we all do it. I mean, like, I'm guilty of any number of cliched phrasing and moments and kind of lazinesses about describing things, and you get into like conceptions about Peleas or whatever. I mean, positively and negatively, an assumption. I mean, any kind of like groupthink or like laziness is should be rooted out, but we're all there. I mean, in terms of just like the way I've always felt about Peleus is the way that I feel like, or Tristan or whatever. I mean, any opera or Bohème is the way I feel now, and not to kind of arrive at each performance, not without my, I mean, I always say like I'm being like paid for my prejudices, like, and yet you want to be kind of like arriving open-minded and fair, and like approaching each performance as as it is a fresh experience, even though you're coming at it with your opinions and your prejudices and everything. So I mean, what I thought you were going to talk about is an interesting issue, which is like kind of changes in the repertory and in the canon, which is like, I think that like Chenier is a good example of like, but before our eyes, like over the past few decades, has begun to like recede from the repertoire. I mean, you can kind of say that Verismo, I mean, yeah, you can make, I mean, I think Chenier is certainly less central than it was in the middle of the 20th century. But then, I mean, other things, it's interesting to watch like Faust go from being like one of the central works to kind of ever more of a rarity, kind of. I mean, it's beginning.
Well, that's okay.
I'm all for it. No, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and it's interesting to see what the ones that happen like in front of our very eyes, like when you see, I mean, Handel, obviously, and Baroque opera, but also, I mean, Janacek, which you mentioned before. And I think, like, I mean, even Wozzeck, I mean, is a different piece, like, in the repertory now, and I think is, like, kind of thought of differently than it was even a few decades ago. And so
my first opera.
So good.
What was your first opera?
I officially, I went with school when I was in elementary school to see Cavpag, but I think of it, Bohème was really the first, what I think officially where I really remember it.
So what you were saying about bringing your prejudices, I would reframe that to say you're bringing your knowledge and your experience. And I'm not being euphemistic here, but genuinely, that's as we grow, get older, we share our knowledge and we teach. We try to inspire thought in others, not just in our readers and viewers, but also in the people who perform these art forms. I feel that we can teach them sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think that we have to be careful, all of us, not just people who write about this, to not only be stuck on what we might call a gold standard. So the fact that I at the age of 14, saw Norma with Joan Sutherland and Marilyn Horne.
Oh, you're going to kill me.
Well, you weren't born.
Exactly.
You have a good excuse, but I was 14 and I was taken by my dad, who knew that I should be hearing this. And I loved it because I loved the music and I love what those two artists did, and the tenor John Alexander as well. And but is it the best Norma I've ever heard? I don't know, because my preparation at the age of 14, hearing it for the first time, is different from my preparation years later when I've heard many Normas and many conductors and seen many productions. I'm sure I didn't understand anything about the production, which must have been rather static in 1970. But I've seen Cecilia Bartoli do it in a very animated production in Salzburg. Maybe you saw that as well.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other Norma. And whether she vocally is the Norma that Sutherland was, I don't even want to speculate. But we live and grow with these works. And my very first Tosca was Maria Callas, and I wasn't moved, to be perfectly blunt. It was Grace Bunbury years later who made me kind of like Tosca. So, but it's not Callas's fault. I was too young.
I mean, we're always in different places to get different pieces, and different things come differently. I mean, strike, as the kids say, hit different in different moments. I mean, moments of of kind of the year, or like kind of moments of the week. I mean, as opposed to, I mean, and then change with us. And I mean, I love Electra, say, but like I like it less. Like, I mean, I shouldn't say I don't love Electra, and even Salome, like, I mean, a little less so, but like those I was really passionately about when I was a teenager. And like, I think there's something like campy, or like a young gay kid, and like there's something over the topness and brutality and expressionism of it. It felt really good. And I just don't listen to Electra personally, like kind of for fun. I mean, well, that's not exactly true, but anyway, like it's not a piece that's as important to me anymore. Whereas kind of some pieces have gotten much more so, and feel deeper to me. And like, I mean, I think I'm not necessarily just because of the plot, but because just like where you're at aesthetically and what feels right, where you want to spend several hours, the world that you want to live in for a while. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it's nice, and to be a critic for a long time, you can kind of like chart your changes. I think some critics are sometimes fearful of changing opinions about things or singers, and like that leads to the laziness, like, I mean, that we were talking about before. If like, just because I'm perceived as an advocate for a certain singer or conductor or orchestra, I can then never, like, I feel like I'm then in the little prison of never being able to express the opposite opinion. And I think that that's really exciting to see. You, like, I mean, that gives you all kinds of ability to say I mean, you just want to always be honest to yourself, and you can acknowledge, like, I usually like X, Y, and Z, or they usually do this, I don't know why it was like X. And so to kind of be a critic as you go on is to be able to reflect your own changes, become reflected, and that's in style of writing and in your your opinions about things.
Well, I want to pick up on that in about 30 seconds, but I have one quick question before. Did I hear that you had a picture of Birgit Nielsen on your wall when you were a kid?
I did. Speaking of as Salome, yes, I did. That was my pinup girl. So it gives you just. It was that was before I came out of the closet, so it was sort of, it was not a surprise to anyone.
Mine was Ingrid Bergman, but
there, exactly. I mean, at least Ingrid Bergman had a certain conventional beauty that was different. At least mildly
but she couldn't
plausible.
Sing like Nielsen. But exactly, I just realized something, Zach. I just realized something. We both had Swedish women on our walls.
There you go.
Wow. Wow, we're gonna have to explore that. Anyway,
Exactly. That'll be a few weeks in therapy.
um, you were talking about reflecting your own changes and evolution and preferences and so on. I'm completely with you there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that there's a delicate line that we who write about and teach and communicate and interview about these art forms we love, the degree to which we are part of the subject matter. So there are many critics and journalists in general who will not in any way enter the discourse.
Mm-hmm.
There is what was called the new journalism, which is not so new anymore. It's about 50 years old. Tom
Yeah.
Wolfe, others, I'm suddenly forgetting, the guy at the New Yorker, who basically they were part of the story. And the fellow at the New Yorker, whose name I'm forgetting, did a piece on Marina Poplovskaya in which he flew to Argentina and spoke about crossing the street with her in Buenos Aires carrying her bags.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in the story and finding her fainted on the floor. And he was part of the story. And I think that there are certain circumstances in which we can and should reveal ourselves. And I'm going to name the story of yours in a moment where you do that
Mm-hmm.
beautifully. But where do you stand on the idea that we, the writer, communicator, what part of the equation do we fit in if we do?
Um, ask it a little differently. Ask it a little differently.
Do you use do you say I when you write a review?
Yeah,
Do you say I when you do an interview and I flew to Salzburg and spoke to Anna Netrebko?
yeah. I mean, I think it's about it's the where it's piece by piece. It's what is right for the story, and the time is to sort of stay away, like, again, as a convention, to stay away from the first person or extensive use of the first person. But I have written a lot of stories in the first person, or with certainly like forays, like significant or kind of conspicuous forays into the first person. I think it's just about good writing. Like, the first person has also become, what was really refreshing has now become its own cliche. Like, and so, like, the new journalism, the basic principles, like, that make total sense and are correct, but it now reads as its own cliche. Like, what as everything is, when, like, you kind of have a cliche and then kind of deconstruct it, and then that deconstruction is its own, becomes a norm. And so I think that a restraint with it is right and is good. And so I don't I don't believe in overusing it or using it for the sake of using it. I think, especially with critical things, the I is assumed. You're speaking, it's blatantly subjective judgments, though you don't want to kind of then hide behind the, like, institutional voice of the times, and, like, you want to own what you're saying. And I think it's helpful, especially now, in an I, like, kind of justly done, can be a reminder that this is a person, like, that this isn't the judgment of the New York. It's hard to avoid that that's the judgment of the New York Times, but that there is a person, this is like kind of a subjective judgment that's one person, one writer is making. And I think that an I in there, like, kind of the use of the first person, again, in the context of what we consider good writing, however you want to kind of square that, I think can be helpful. And so that the answer is sometimes. And so, yeah, there are really successful uses of the first person in journalism, and especially in criticism and in reporting even. And it comes up. I tend to, maybe I'm just so in the times at this point that, like, I think that restraining it is more powerful and makes and to kind of a certain degree of restraint or implied visibility is better than being blatantly in the first person, and achieves much of the same. When you basically, like with any writing technique, you want it to mean something. Like, it's not just what you do. It's not like you don't want there to be any habit or whatever. But to err on the side of a certain kind of restraint and third person, but if it's meaningful, I think we should do it. And we do it, I mean, as a paper, I mean, as a news organization, and certainly me personally, more than it used to be done, but not all the time. And sometimes it kind of can be sort of sprinkled in. It doesn't have to be that the whole review is sort of like lodged in the first person, or that I is the first word, or you know what I mean? And the sense of it being a first person essay. But many examples come to mind, but there was one, I mean, when the whole big scandal first hit about James Levine, I had written a notebook about kind of maestros and the maestro myth, and about Yannick, and about other Jaap van Zweden, and the conception of just what the implication, I mean, nothing that other people did not comment, but just the sense of like the way in which certain paternal self-conceptions don't make any of this easier, like the way that we can think of conductors as different. And at the end, I talked about, I kind of moved to the first person about reconsiderations that I had come to about the tenure of Alan Gilbert at the New York Philharmonic. And I do that in the first person, unless I'm almost sure that I do, because, and how I sort of, what I had sort of thought was sort of a weakness or whatever, was to me like the modesty that now, like a certain approach to the job that then sort of seemed, after a number of years had passed, in light of all of this stuff, to be increasingly compelling. And I put that in the first person, like, because it was it was a personal, I wanted to kind of, you know, I mean, mea culpa in a way, or just to say that like what we were saying with like your conceptions of Electra might change, your thoughts about different artists change over the years, and like kind of artists who might not have spoken to you, or where now suddenly it's like, oh, I get what, either on a musical level, or in this sense, like on more like kind of almost a philosophical level now, kind of they speak to you. So
I can say that I, for one, really miss Alan Gilbert at the podium in New York.
Yeah. Oh my God. Now
I loved his work then. I mean, we could talk endlessly about the music directors of the New York Philharmonic. I knew many of them. I don't know Alan Gilbert all that well. We've met, but I can't say I really know him.
Mm-hmm.
I will, because I love the quotation, name what Leonard Bernstein, who I knew very well, said, "I have been all over the world and have never seen a statue to a critic."
Exactly. It's so true. No, yeah. No, I mean, I don't know that like that. I mean, so it was not that I wanted to like recant some judgments that I had made about Alan Gilbert's conducting, and there were a couple of reviews, I mean, which I've for whatever reason had like looked back on, where it's like they were tough. I mean, but I don't think that they were wrong. It was more that like the conception of the role I get now, like, I mean, and I get, and I think is what felt like it had more legitimacy than I felt. I mean, any of us who are, I mean, yeah, we can talk. I mean, I think that you don't want to kind of run away from your personal ambivalences and conflicts and the complexities. I mean, yeah, there's like, I mean, critics also like have this dual, like, we want the Riccardo Mutis and just that old school vision of the maestro papa of the orchestra, like, who is that just with the big hair, like the hair and the everything, and the amazing kind of like
Zach, we like Riccardo Muti for his hair.
Well, that's I of course, it's exactly, but and then we want also like this kind of we resist that, and I mean, and I think that the more that can be, you can kind of, I mean, I don't like people who like kind of are going through the more that kind of those conflicts and complexities can be reflected in your writing, the better. And like, and not to kind of pretend in your writing that you've come to conclusions that don't reflect where you're at. I mean, again, what we were saying before, it's the avoid laziness, or just kind of like that that's what I'm supposed to think, and I'll just write that. And to say, like, which I say in this piece, is that like, oh, there's like there is this longing for like a lead. I mean, there's a reason that this conductor, that a certain sense of who a conductor is, has lingered and persists, because there is something to it. There's something very satisfying and seductive about it, and it's not all bad, and yet like it's not sufficient, and obviously, and so it's anyway. So I think that the first person can be powerful in getting you into some of these issues.
You anticipated what my next topic was, which was actually Riccardo Muti, but I want to say that I remembered the name of the New Yorker writer. It's Gay Talese, who's a very fine writer, very, very fine writer, but he was part of the story when he wrote. Specifically that, Zach, you know that I did a lot of my upper training in Italy, and I worked at La Scala and read Corriere della Sera, which was the New York Times of Italy then. And again, there was nothing online, so I would go to the Giornalaio, the newsstand, and buy Corriere every evening. And the critic, the music critic, longtime music critic for Corriere, was named Paolo Isotta,
of course.
I-S-O-T-T-A, which means Isolde in Italian. Paul Isolde is the best name for a music critic. And Paolo Isotta was from Naples, as was Muti. And he had a very strong solidarity with Southern Italian great musicians, of which there have been boundless numbers. They're wonderful. But Paolo Isotta wrote in a very antiquated style, which is to say that everything was the royal we.
Mm-hmm.
We were present at the opening of the production of what's his name, Salieri's L'Europa Riconosciuta, which was December of 2004. And we appreciated Riccardo Muti's endeavor to revive this opera, which opened Il Teatro del Piermarini. In other words, La Scala, you don't name the theater, you name the architect. Piermarini was the architect.
Yeah.
And you really have to have a master's degree in Italian history and musicology to have read Paolo Isotta. And he was very intimidating to a lot of readers, but also they would hold him up as this is what music criticism should be.
Yeah.
And he had the right to be in the royal we. He died recently, and they were buried in Naples. And the problem was, I'll call it a problem, is that he would spend 90% of his article praising Riccardo Muti, and you had no idea what the opera was about, and you had no idea who the singers were. Diana Damrau was the lead, and that was all you'd get. Right. And but there was a fetishistic attraction to reading Paolo Isotta, because he could be very full of praise or very cruel. But the Corriere would have separate articles. This is something I love about that paper, is that even now, December 7th opens La Scala. For days ahead of time, they will have whole inserts and sections about the opera that's being done, and musicologists and scholars and sociologists and feminists and gay activists, whatever the inspiration is, everybody would weigh in on the opera that was being done. And they'd have interviews with the artists, and they would have gossip from backstage, and the entire nation would be focused on the opera that was opening La Scala. And it would be a form of education about what that opera is. And then Paolo Isotta would weigh in almost immediately, because he often would go to the final dress rehearsal as a preview and basically draft his article.
That he would get the kind of this VIP treatment.
Yes, but then, having attended the opening, his article would basically be put to bed, as we say, unless he would make adjustments such as Muti didn't conduct.
Right.
That kind of thing. You know, this is a famous story.
Unfortunate for the article.
There's a very famous story in New York of a local paper when Leonard Warren, the great baritone, died during a performance of La Forza del Destino at the Met, and the critic didn't go. And he wrote an article and wrote that Leonard Warren was never better. So, and it went into print.
Yeah, of
But
course.
what I'm saying about Isolta and about Muti is that often these relationships are fetishistic. And there was an advocacy there. This is not a judgment of Muti's music making that goes well beyond covering the event. And I think it's different kinds of journalism. We don't really have that in the States because even in our arts reporting, we come more from a news angle.
Well, I mean, I mean, I mean, the Times helpfully is a little bit more insulated from this, but in smaller papers, the relationships like between orchestras and critics. I mean, there was the whole kind of Donald Rosenberg, I mean, kerfluffle is an understatement in Cleveland when, I mean, in the early years of Velsermost's tenure as music director there, where the critic was really, I mean, extremely negative about Velsermost, and it became like I mean, he was eventually fired. It was a whole to do, and so yeah, I mean, and there's these cities where there's really one paper and like it's a smaller city can be weird and like a little claustrophobic, but yeah, I mean, it's a little bit less. Like, I agree that there's in European music criticism, it's a little more essayistic. It's a little more, I mean, yes, it's, and in that case, the kind of the personal slant and the personal prejudices, and I mean, the relationship that people have with the artists is different as well. And like much more, and especially with like intendants and like more, less with, I mean, but like, you kind of have the inside, like certain critics like kind of have like an inside track on things and are very close with the I mean, really kind of not, if not friends, then like, I mean, it's sort, and not that I don't think it's necessarily like nefarious, but it's definitely like, it's not the relationship that I have where it's like, I mean, occasionally there are like kind of social, like, I mean, a dinner with an artist where it's not like a particular interview, but like I pay, like, I mean, the Times pays for it. It is a fact find. I mean, like, I'm not friends with artists. Like, it's just not the case. And so, and where it's sort of like, and it, I mean, and yes, and if there happened to be a thing that would have to be kind of like a thing that was sort of dealt with and like thought about and considered. I mean, and I go back and forth. I mean, obviously the history of criticism is of a lot of enmeshment, more enmeshment than now, between the worlds of performers and creators and journalists and critics and writers. And now, I mean, as there's been more kind of professionalization of all of these practices, and like they are in their I mean, much more in separate tracks, which I think is in general for the best. With, I mean, though, yeah, I mean, that sense of like I mean, with all his prejudices, Virgil Thompson gets by being like kind of in the belly of the beast and a composer himself is, I mean, it can be ridiculous, kind of the double dealing, but it does lead to kind of like a richness and a flair to the writing. So yeah, I mean, it's you try not to have sacred horses, what is it, sacred cows.
Cows.
Cows. I was like, the horse is not right. No, you try and not have people where there's a relation, like, I mean, and that's why you don't have a relationship, because you don't want to feel like it's worshipful or whatever. And like when it comes, I mean, with Muti, like I've written some big, like intense Muti. I mean, for instance, like he was doing that series of concert operas for which a lot of us have traveled to Chicago because they've been remarkable performances. And he did like a Falstaff that was just really like one of the great things, just like unbelievable, I thought. I mean, and just perfect. I mean, like one of the great nights. And then two years later, did Aida most recently in that same concert opera context. And it was different set of singers, different piece, different whatever. And like my review was was more mixed and about not just the particular performance, but about his approach. And his sort of philosophy and the way I think what he would agree with is his aesthetic, and like kind of like a disagreement in a certain respect about the effect of that. And so I did like that. That does not change my like massive respect and like admiration for Muti, and he's a fascinating artist, and like there have been some unbelievable some of the great performances of my short, where I'm catching him at a certain stage of his career, but even that, like even over the past 10, 15 years, overwhelming stuff. And then so sometimes it doesn't work for me, and I think that works. I don't think I have to like kind of carry water for Muti. Is that the right thing? Carry
the water.
Good. Okay. All my idioms are in a row.
Or the hairspray.
Exactly. I don't have to carry the hairspray for Muti, and that can I think that's just fine. That's the way I don't want to feel like that makes me uncomfortable to feel like I am too much of a fan of somebody. But then there are some artists I'm just like kind of, you write your prejudices. There are some artists who are just like you're just totally there for them, even if they're controversial people, and you shouldn't avoid just being enthusiastic either, and consistently enthusiastic, even if people, this comes up a lot, less with me, but other artists with like Anna Netrebko. And there are some people who are just like writers and critics who are like kind of just there for everything that she will do, and will kind of, and that's part of our idiosyncrasies as critics as well, like just that. And it's a problem if that blinds you, or is like, but like as like little idiosyncratic corners, or there are some people where you just know like, oh, and that's him and Netrebko, or her and Netrebko, and right. We're all people, and we all have our idiosyncrasies, sure. And the composers we love, I know that some people will not go there with me about French Baroque opera, which I will go.
Oh, I will.
Exactly. But there's some people for whom that's not their cup of tea for whatever, and I'm just like way there. And so, and you just have to be who you are. Yeah.
Speaking of France, you were talking about composers who were critics, and one of my 2 or 3 favorite composers is Berlioz.
Yeah.
And he started out as a critic, and it did him no good for much of his career, because he was very critical in the negative sense of Auber and Gounod to a certain degree, and Delibes, and he was right, frankly, in my view.
Totally.
But it really made him unwelcome in the French musical establishment after that. So if you're setting out to be a musician or a composer, it may not be a good idea to start as a critic. I want to make something clear for our listeners that you and I understand, that you were talking about Cleveland, but it could be most cities in the United States, that the arts reporter may be one individual who covers the news aspects of the arts as well as the reviewing, and not just the music, but it might be the theater, it might be film reviews, it might be books occasionally. And the New York Times is a very different situation, and always has been, in that you have a theater editor, you have a dance editor, I believe, certainly a dance writer. You have a classical music and opera editor, which is you, and there's pop music, and there are books, and all these different editors. And then there are people, whether they're on staff, such as Anthony Tomasini for music, or contributors who are part of the circle of the New York Times. And I know Anthony Tomasini. I also know many of your contributors. And when people read them in the Times, it's not that people necessarily understand who is on staff, who's a contributor. The fact that you, as the editor, can send out 5 different people on a night in New York City to cover 5 different events, and that is only part of what gets covered, and you, I would imagine, as the editor, will make some of those decisions, and perhaps a writer will come to you and say, I think this artist is very interesting and I would like to write about her.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes the New York Times quite different from most media organizations.
I think different. I mean, I don't know enough. I mean, it's pretty unique. I mean, like, and the cultural cover, not just classical, but like cultural coverage in general, the richness of the criticism and report, like to have like somebody who's these beat reporters in these different disciplines really be, I mean, it's a commitment, and that it is, the Times has this internal commitment that this is part of who the identity of the paper is, about its culture coverage, and that is one of the jewels, that's one of the things that really sets us apart.
So we often hear the lament, everybody's a critic. And what I think that's about nowadays is the fact that with social media, there's been a certain flattening of the critical landscape, in that anyone can post something and write a review. And I've seen excellent restaurants, for example, be brought down because someone will write, they don't make lasagna like my grandma. Well, I don't care. Do you like the lasagna? Is it good? Similarly, there are chat rooms and websites and social media of all kinds in which people weigh in, and they tend to be the most cranky and opinionated. Whether, I mean, I, for WQXR, have read all kinds of comments on my articles, some of them attacking me, others attacking or praising the people I'm writing about. And I don't review that much, but I tend to cover issues in the arts.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have things such as Yelp and TripAdvisor and Amazon comments and so on. And frankly, not everybody has the preparation to do that. And I worry, in the case of, let's say, the arts, but also anything creative or anything in which people's jobs are on the line. If a restaurant is knocked, if someone says, I saw a mouse in the restaurant,
Mm-hmm.
that may be one mouse on one occasion, and we don't know if it was actually a mouse or they had too much to drink. But these little things can skew so much. Is there a way of creating, I don't want to call it a hierarchy, but a sense of that Zachary Woolfe, you read him, and whether or not you agree, at least you know that he's adhering to certain standards and has a certain preparation? And I don't just mean you, but any critic that you would engage in music, but also in any area where opinion is expressed.
I think it's, I mean, interestingly, like, I think the missing thing, that the crucial thing is not the writers and their preparation so much as to have an editors, like an editing, like, and the infrastructure of that. And again, I mean, like, blogging, social media, all of that, there's a lot of people who are really good and very knowledgeable, and like it's contributed a lot. It's just like it's a different ecosystem than it used to be. I mean, criticism, and what to me sets kind of criticism apart is an editing process, a process of like discrimination and deliberation about what is going to be said and how, and an infrastructure to kind of like, beyond the writer, to kind of guide that to publication, makes it, that to me makes a difference. Perhaps that's just like kind of like self-aggrandizing as an editor, but I think that's how I mean, I don't sort of there was a period, I mean, this is now kind of in the past, where there was a lot of like, this isn't criticism, like it's on it's on a blog, and like, but, and I mean, there's amazing stuff that has been produced from blogs, and then there's a lot of, listen, the Times makes corrections all the time, and like it makes mistakes, and so it's not like an editing process insulates you against errors of fact or judgment. It's some insulation from that, and it's just another more consideration, and the more I mean, I think that's a good, like, the more craft, the more care, the more consideration, and deliberation that go in, the better. And so that is the way that I kind of discriminate between those, but not to kind of say that there's not an exciting and important and helpful discourse going on.
But I do worry about accuracy and vetting. People are certainly entitled to, I think it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Senator from New York, who said people are entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their facts. In other words, that a fact is a fact. And obviously in aesthetic things, we can all have our opinions. But if I were to say to you, for example, that tortellini are from Naples, that's just not true. They're from Bologna.
Right.
And that's a fact. And there are many things that are purported as fact that I read in online forums that are even serious ones that I just know are wrong. And I am inclined to want to provide correctives, but I also don't want to have to engage with debates with people all the time over these things. And
sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, a lot of it is just, I mean, how much you or one wants to be in the comments and in the chat, like whatever with people. And like, it's, I think that it's not that it is, it's silly to be, I don't do it. Like, I mean, it's just not what I'm like kind of going, like, I'm usually not really like in there in the comments of even when I post something on Facebook, like, and it's, and I think that everyone's different in that. It's, so I mean, I think it's whatever your kind of level of interest and whatever your kind of stomach is for that. And so, it varies.
A very fine singer, a very veteran American singer said to me a couple of years ago, if you believe the good reviews, then you have to believe the bad ones. And he recognizes that there are serious critics with a great deal of preparation. And he used to read reviews and then he stopped because he found that many of the critics or commenters did not have the preparation. And it just worked with his head. And he said to me that there are certain few writers he still reads because he knows that they come from a place of preparation. But it's hard enough to get up in front of 4,000 people at the Met or La Scala or wherever and just do what they do anyway. So I mentioned that as I'm transitioning because I want to conclude with you in a few minutes just mention two more things. One is, you gave a great list of recommended listening for our listeners. And I would, for the most part, and this is no complaint from me, call them mainstream. And most of them are older singers, Jesse Norman, Beverly Sills, John Vickers, Luciano Pavarotti, who were they foundational for you in forming your taste, or why did you pick the ones you picked?
Well, I mean, I had picked, the word that you used was inspirational, things that had been inspiring. And so, I had picked just a few selections that for me had been early loves. And I mean, things that had really kind of, I thought, kind of shaped the way that I hear opera or want to hear it. And so, I mean, it's hard to pick, obviously, but I mean, I wanted to pick some of the end of Macropolis Case, or some of it, because that was the performance. It wasn't my first opera. I had been to a bunch, but that was the first. That was I think, like a formative experience in that kind of. I look back on, this was when Kathy Malfitano did it at the Met, and I look back on that as what is possible in the art form to me, like, and kind of just with the whole musically, dramatically, and as an integrated whole with a piece that is good. So I wanted to have a little bit of that, and then I mean, I have, because what is on there that
he's got
Phil's doing a little bit of
Jesse Norman. You have Giulio Cesare with Beverly Sills, Vadoro Pupille, the end of Otello with John Vickers, and the duet with Luciano Pavarotti and Dominic Cossa.
Oh yeah,
from
the bell quarter.
and then finally Gotham Lullaby for voice and piano with Meredith Monk.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I tried to kind of like, there was like some mix of like tragedy and some comedy, even though I mean, Elysir is not exactly, I mean, it's not comic exactly. I mean, but that that kind of a lighter feel, that like kind of romance and melancholy.
It's
And
a comédie larmoyante, a tearful
exactly.
comedy. Yeah,
Exactly. No, and I mean, you listen to Sills do that. I mean, this was specifically the kind of the decorated, the final section of Adoro Pupille, and it's like, this is an amazing vocal, just vocal and, I mean, yeah, spiritual achievement, which I feel like is the same thing when Jesse Norman does. He's got the whole world in his hands, and yeah, I mean, I love that there's a lot of Pavarotti. I mean, like there's always a sense of like wanting to choose just the Bohème aria but with that duet, I mean, it shows how wonderful his interplay can be with other performers. I mean, so there's that voice in that part with that piece. I mean, that piece is just so wonderful, and I love that duet. I mean, I wanted to do also like a kind of two males as a duet. I mean, and I mean, a relatively unusual, not the kind of standard male-female love duet, of which there are many wonderful Pavarotti examples. But I love that. I just love that piece, and this is the best. And I mean, Meredith Monk, in terms of just another way of looking at the voice and what the voice could do, and specifically like textlessness, and like the ways in which like kind of the voice could be a personal expression without text. I mean, that I think was important for me and for many other people. And Vickers, I mean, doing that recording with the Seraphin recording, totally.
Leonie Rieseneck.
I mean, well, and Gobi and everything. I mean, it's just one of the great. On my college application, we had to do what were our favorite recordings, and I said it was like a tie between that recording of Otello and the Supremes Ultimate Collection.
Yeah, I get that.
That's all that's all that you need. And so yeah, so it was you could go on, and I mean, there's a lot that is not there, and it was like kind of popular or very accessible favorites, I think, and yet I wanted to kind of, it gave a sense of sort of where I came from, I thought, with the art form. There's no beer get there. I wanted to give like a sense, what was like kind of the most pleasurable thing I could think of, like, I mean, in terms of just like what is pure inspiration. I mean, I was trying to be as not headish as possible and just be like, what really kind of sends me there.
I also think that Birgit Nilsson's voice was never done justice on recording.
I wish I could. I mean, that is
it was something in the theater that just I don't experience on recording. I want to mention a couple of things that you raised. One is that listeners can go to vimeo.com and enter Fred Plotkin on Fridays, and you could find my conversation with Catherine Malfitano from last fall. You could see how inspiring she was, and how is as a person, but was in the opera, and how she could completely animate such a difficult role as E.M., Emilia Marti, or whatever name we want to give the character. If you don't know the opera, she has many names, all with E.M. And the other is that Pavarotti, listeners know this, was a close friend of mine for 29 years. So that's an example of someone that I could never speak impartially about, although I do tend to speak accurately about him. And I was the consultant on Ron Howard's film about Pavarotti because we really knew each other. We were very close. And it's a privilege sometimes in the arts to get to know these people, not because he was famous and so on, but to get to know them and understand the pressures and the challenges they face. And he certainly did. So Zach, I want to close because I know you got to get going with one of my favorite articles of yours that I read. I don't know when you wrote it because I haven't read it lately, but I can practically quote it. It's an article about when you decided to give away your cello. WQXR, where I work, each year has a drive to gather instruments to give to people, young people usually, who can't afford their instruments. And here's an example of an article in which it was first person. You wrote I and about your relationship to your cello and to music and to everything that it meant to you and means to you. But I must say, I still have not given away my clarinet. And I was thinking that you're a stronger, better man than I, that you were able to do that. So would you talk about that article? Because I want people to find it. It's a beautiful piece of journalism, but also memoir, whatever you want to call it. But talk about that article.
Well, thank you. No, it now feels like a very long time ago. And it was a period. I mean, it would be interesting to revisit now, because I am in a period now where it's sort of, your life with music, as we were saying, everything kind of goes through shifts and evolutions, and I'm left, really kind of with a nostalgia for having a cello. But at that point, I had played the cello for many years, and it had, at that point, it had become sort of a thing that was weighing on me, like as a kind of sort of scolding me in a way, like in a sense, kind of like a little guilt inducing in the corner there. And there was this opportunity to kind of donate it to someone who could use it. And it struck me that this would be a better use of it than just making like kind of a source of mild bitterness for me. And so it was absolutely kind of the right thing to do then. And it was good it was really helpful to write through and to, we say to write through, or something to kind of write about, and to kind of come to the sense that, like, my life in music was richer now than it had ever, at that point, and now it is true, than it had ever been. I was much more of a musician, or immersed in music, let's say, than I was when I was playing the cello all the time. And that felt like a being in music that was way more, and not that I was never a professional, or I never wanted to be kind of a professional cellist, but kind of like a serious amateur musician. And I felt I was only more in music after I stopped playing the cello than I was when I was playing it. I think, and I remember writing this, that it provides an amazing and important aspect to being a critic, to have been even an amateur performer. I think to have some kind of sense of like preparing a piece of music, going in front of an audience, even on like a very different level than, it's not like a singer approaching the Met. And I don't think that you need to, it's like you don't need to direct a film to review film beautifully, but it helps to have been on a film set. I think to kind of
New York City.
Apologize for New York.
New York City.
Exactly. I want a big corner. I think that experience was crucial for me, and yet I was ready, and so I was. It was bittersweet, but very nice to write that, and I'm glad.
Well, part of the beauty of that article, apart from the beautiful writing and the communication, is the ability that it had in me, and I'm sure not just in me, to arouse contemplation and those own feelings. And I can't part with my clarinet. I think maybe the cello is a bigger instrument. My clarinet sits in the closet and it's in its little white case. But my clarinet also, I related to the fact that when I was in 8th grade, and it was expensive to get me that clarinet, some rotten kid whose name I remember his name now, I'm not going to name him, stole the clarinet. And on the last day of school, I saw him walking, I didn't know he did it, walking out with the clarinet, and I'm not violent. I don't hit people. I beat him up. I
Oh my
beat him to
God.
the ground. Was bigger than I am. And I just beat him to a pulp and took my clarinet. And I said, how dare you, Eve was his first name, take my clarinet and prevent me when I couldn't afford to get another clarinet, prevent me from playing.
Yeah.
And I played it for about another 2 years after that, but it was just never the same.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a talisman there for me. And at some point, the right person will get it, but I sort of feel I have to entrust it to someone rather than the very noble thing that you did of giving it to WQXR, which then passed it along to a deserving person, kind of like a heart donor.
Right. There was a sense that was a justification. But yeah, for me too, it was a talisman, especially once I became a critic. It felt like I needed to continue to like be like, oh, and I have I play the cello, and that was a sort of, you might doubt my credentials, but I'm for real as a writer even, and that sort of began. I mean, as I got more confident as a writer, that began to be less important as well. But it was a difficult thing. I mean, but it felt very nice not to just kind of like throw it out, but to kind of pass it on in a way. But as I said at the beginning, I'm not unhappy I did it, but I was like, oh, it would be nice to kind of return to the cello in some way. I mean, not necessarily seriously, but like it would be just to play. I mean, because now listening to so much music, I mean, I have a different approach to music than I did 10 years ago or whatever, certainly than I did when I was younger and like playing a lot. And I feel like I would, in that, I mean, it was, even when I was there, it was my thoughts about what I wanted to play and how I wanted to play outstripped what I was able to do with the amount of practicing I was doing. And so that was always like the frustration, is like I felt like I was kind of musical, but you have to like make it happen. And it was, and so like I kind of could hear how I wanted things to sound very well, and like what I wanted to play. And it was a lot of fun.
Have you thought about getting a new cello?
Yeah, I mean, I have thought. Thought it's a big investment, but it's something that I've thought about, and if a cello could appear before me today, I wouldn't say no. It would, like, it's the kind of thing where I've not yet. I don't know if it's the investment I want to make right this second, because with instruments it's hard, because you can't, if you want even a basically playable cello is a lot. And so but I would not say no. The last cello that I have held, I was left alone in a dressing room with Yo-Yo Ma's cello, and he was like, oh, here, play this. I have to go like for a second. And I was interviewing him, and he just like left it in my hands. And so I played that I did play a little bit, the Yo-Yo Strad. So that has been, it's a bit that it'll be a step down from that, whatever it might be.
Yeah, but it's a good thing to add to your memoir that you've played Yo-Yo Ma's Strad. Zachary Woolfe, it has been a pleasure to catch up with you. And I know that listeners who don't know the role of the classical music editor, and you personally, learned a great deal today, and that was part of my goal. Okay. And I look forward to seeing you in theaters and concert halls and who knows where else.
I hope so.
And in the meantime, keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. No, it's really been a pleasure.
Take care.
You too.